I've also uploaded all the instructions on the Moodle page under topic 10, class activities. So if you need to refresh your memory from something we did a month or two ago, they're there to help you. Otherwise, this week we're going to be diving into the topic of will AI take our jobs? Feels like every year of the course I have to change some part of the text, and so this is very much still a work in progress, much like the COVID crisis used to be. And so it's going to be divided into sort of two halves. The first half is going to cover automation that we've seen over the past century, few decades. You know, think about this as the traditional automation of sort of robotics and mechanical automation. And then we're going to have a second half where we deal with artificial intelligence and obviously a bit more provisional, less data to go on and certainly less research. And that's going to be the second half of this topic. All right, so here are some of the core texts that we're going to be citing from when it comes to this part of the course. So if you want to dive deeper, make sure you do these, download these papers. And so we're going to start off with a discussion of what history can tell us. Because the future is always uncertain. It's hard to forecast what's going to happen tomorrow. But the best way to start, or even to have a reasonable attempt at forecasting what will happen in the future, and trying to answer that question of will robots take our jobs, is to look at what's happened in the past. And if we look back in the past, we've seen a continual stream of automation. So if you go back all the way to 1900, so 125 years ago, almost the majority of jobs in the US were in agriculture, probably even higher in Australia, given our agricultural-based economy. Flash forward to 2012, and only 1.5% of all jobs in agriculture. So we've seen this massive disruption just in how agriculture and farm work has been done. It used to be a lot of people, and if we went back even further than 1900, it would be the vast majority of people working on farms. Now it's a tiny slither of the overall economy. Did this cause mass unemployment? Obviously no. And why is that the case? We sort of fired these people off the farms. Well, it's because they moved from working on farms to working in offices, doing manufacturing jobs and service jobs. And so you can see this, if we zoom in, where the data is slightly better on the 20th century, the same story happens in the manufacturing sector. In the 1950s, about 1/3 of all workers in the US were working in the manufacturing sector, whether that's on the factory floor or something to do with the manufacturing sector. Today, that's less than 10% of all US jobs are in manufacturing. And again, did we see shrinking the share of people working in the manufacturing sector by 1/3? Did we see a mass rise in unemployment? No. Instead, we saw jobs and services increase. Now, obviously, we've seen recessions along the way that have resulted in increases in unemployment. But if you take the long-run structural viewpoint, unemployment is the lowest it's been today in many, many years. And in fact, the low unemployment rate hides how many jobs we've created, because if we look at the employment to population ratio over the 20th century, we've actually seen a boom in the amount of people working in the official workforce. And that's because over the course of the 20th century, we've seen the entry of women into the workforce. So previously, a lot of them would have been working at home, sort of not officially counted as being working. But now they participate in the labour force at a much, much higher rate. And we've also seen the baby boomers enter the workforce, this big splurge of a population bulge, which has also added, or at least previously added, a lot of people to the labour force. Now they're obviously leaving the labour force. And so, if we look at the data as best we can tell, you can see if you go back to 1840, the vast majority of people worked in the agricultural sector. Almost everybody worked on a farm to keep themselves fed. And that's been on a one-way trajectory downwards, basically continually every decade from the 1800s to today. If we look at the manufacturing sector, we're seeing a bit of an uptick over the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century as the US economy, like many other economies, industrialized. But since the 1950s and 60s, even that sector has been on the decline. And the service sector, which has sort of sucked in all the other workers from these other sectors and the new people being added to the economy, has just risen inexorably. And that's true not just of the US economy, but of almost every OECD country. You know, in Australia, we talk a lot about, we have so many, such a mining economy. We have a big agricultural sector that, obviously produces food that gets exported around the world. But if you were to, sort of shrink the Australian labour force down to a representative 10-person sample, only one person in that 10-person representative sample would work in the manufacturing or mining industries. In the mining sector, it's very, very small. Manufacturing, a bit more. But 9 out of 10 workers in Australia don't work in manufacturing or mining or agriculture. They work in the service sector, whether it's being a nurse, a teacher, working in advertising, producing some form of service. At the end of the day, even in economies that have a lot of iron ore under the ground and have vast tracts of fertile land, most people don't work in the agricultural or mining sectors. And why is that? Well, it's because we've seen waves and waves of automation that have rendered that employment unnecessary, or at least less worthwhile than the jobs you can get in the service sector. So here you can see the manufacturing sector in detail, and it's been basically a steady downwards trend. This is looking, sort of two cuts of the data. One is just looking at the overall numbers of workers in the manufacturing sector, and you can see those workers, the number has sort of bopped around, but generally trended downwards. And then if you look at it as a share of all employees, that red line, you can see a pretty consistent downward trend. Now, there are some cyclical business cycle patterns around here. What we tend to see in these declining sectors, or at least declining sectors of employment, is that things collapse during a recession and they sort of just don't bounce back during the boom. So that's what you tend to see happening in terms of the dynamics of the data, but still the long run trend is only in one direction. And here you can see the data on the employment to population ratio. So this counts the share of the population that is working as a share of the population overall. So why is this different from the unemployment rate? Well, this factor here takes into account changes due to, say, people who were previously stay-at-home mothers who are in modern times much more likely to work. And it also takes into account students and retirees who aren't looking for work, but are obviously part of the population overall. Yep?
What you just mentioned about the trend that kind of follows the business cycle.
Mm-hmm.
You might come to this later, but do you think that will be the same with like increasing use of artificial intelligence, or do you think it might disrupt that kind of pattern?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, here if we look at the just number of people employed, you see that sort of step down during recessions. And I think that's a very plausible way that whatever future patterns in automation and job changes and composition jobs happens, it's going to be one that's accelerated, or those changes manifest themselves during a recession. And that's because what happens during a recession? Well, a lot of businesses go bankrupt, particularly businesses that maybe aren't adapted to the times or integrating new technology. That's a plausible reason why they might be close to going bankrupt when hard times hit. You could also it's often hard to fire people. A lot of the time, you don't want to fire workers, even if technically there's some new technology that can do the job, or you could outsource the job to some other AI firm at a lower cost. And often you only bite that bullet when the hard times hit, and it's either that or going bankrupt. So I think that's a plausible scenario. As we'll see, as we'll discuss, I think it's we're likely to see changes in what jobs people do, and those changes might accelerate during the next recession, whether we see an uptick in unemployment that's permanently higher. Maybe not, but we'll obviously it's the future, it's uncertain. And so, we've seen this big rise, push up in the number of people who are working in the population. So even as we're automating jobs left, right and centre, we've got more and more people working than at any time in the mid part of the 20th century. That line has started to tick downwards after the 2000s. That's primarily a story about the baby boomers. Obviously, both sexes are working sort of equivalent-ish rates these days in the modern economy, but we've now got an increasing number of baby boomers, this large generation who are aging out of the labour force, retiring, and that's going to weigh down on the employment to population ratio. But still, even today, this is a most recent data point. If you laser body doesn't work, but if you look at this most recent data point at about 60%, that's far higher an employment to population ratio than at any point since the 1980s. So even with hordes of baby boomers retiring, we've still got a larger share of the population working than at any time prior to the 1990s. Okay, so the overall picture, if we look at the long-term history, is one of continual employment. Despite the many advances we've made, we've still found time, well, the economy has still managed to employ the vast majority of people who are looking for employment. If you think about it purely in terms of where we sit today, I think that creates a very bullish picture for the future. I mean, by definition, here in 2025, we have had the most technology, the most automation at any point in our history, right? It's very rare we forget how to do something. So today, as we sit, we are the most technologically advanced with the most automation possible. But we also have the lowest unemployment rate, certainly in the past 50 years, with an unemployment rate here in Australia of around 4% and a bit. So we've got the strongest labour market in decades, and we've had the most automation. So I think your sort of base case, just looking at the history, is that mass unemployment is exceptionally unlikely to occur, or at least historically has been the case, it hasn't occurred. But that doesn't mean there won't be no changes to the way the labour market is structured. And so we're next going to dive into a discussion of how economists think about which jobs are created and which jobs are destroyed through the process of automation. Any questions about the history before we move on? Yep.
So you said that more people are entering the workforce, be like stay-at-home mothers and stuff. Is that due to inequality?
Inequality?
Yeah.
I mean, so this change, I would say, mostly unfurled over the 80s and 90s. The female population employment ratio is still, it's been relatively constant. We've hit the sort of peak level. It's still not quite as high as men, because women usually take more time out of the labour force when they have a baby. It's called the Nappy Valley, where the employment to population ratio dips when women start having children. I guess it's changing gender norms would be the obvious explanation for that. All right, so how do economists think about automation? Because it's this very sort of, I guess, hard to, write down a simple supply and demand framework for this. So David Autor has come up with this framework for thinking about automation and how it affects the labour force by thinking about the work we do as employees as completing a number of tasks. In any firm or any business or any job that needs to be done, there are a number of tasks that need to be complete. So I like the example of a cafe. You need to bake goods, you need to sell them at the counter, you need to clean tables, take orders, you need to wash dishes, and you need to post on social media about how great your cafe is to get lots of likes and people coming to your store. All these tasks are required to be completed, and some of those tasks will be completed by capital and machinery, and some of those tasks will be done by humans with their labour. And we can arrange these tasks on a line from the most sort of easy to do by computer to the ones at the other end, which are most easily or cheaply done by labour. You can think of this as a line of comparative advantage. So, on the left-hand side, what capital has the most advantage in? The washing machine, washing dishes. Could you get a human to do it? Yes, but a washing machine does it much more quickly and easily and cheaper. And then on the right-hand side, what's the most labour-orientated task? I guess these days maybe creating viral memes about how great your coffee is. Even AI, I think, would struggle to do that. that's a very labour-intensive task. Or maybe being the person at the counter selling you, on the blueberry muffin. A task much more suited to labour. And so we arrange these tasks on the spectrum between best done by machine, best done by people, and then at some point there'll be a cutting off point where you allocate some tasks to capital and some tasks to labour, and there'll be a point in the middle where capital and labour have a roughly equal comparative advantage, and that'll define who does what. And so what happens when a new form of technology comes along? Well, it can do one of three things. The first thing it can do is replace tasks, render things obsolete that no longer need to be done. Typically, this is tasks previously done by capital that now can be automated out of existence. The second thing it can do is create new tasks that need to be done. Usually that extends the task line towards labour. So it's a new task that labour has to be done. Although, this is sort of arbitrary. You could have some new tasks that sit on the capital side and some replace tasks that sit on the labour side. The third thing new technology can do is it can automate tasks. Say something that was previously done by labour can now be more efficiently done by a piece of machinery. And so you can see by the length of this labour line, or the length of the fraction of tasks done by labour, the effect of any technological change might be positive or negative, depending on what the technology is doing. So thinking about tasks that have been replaced or created, a replaced task might be taking the cash to the bank at your cafe at the end of the day. If we now all use Tap and Go, we no longer need to make the daily trip to the bank to square off accounts and deposit money. It's been a task that was being replaced by new technology. A new task that's been created, well, the rise of social media. Now, these days, any small business needs to have at least someone posting on their behalf in order to advertise the product. That's a new task primarily done by labour that's been created through a new form of technology. What about an automated task? You might think, well, those QR codes that sit on our tables, usually you'd have to have a person run around to take everyone's order, but the development of QR code ordering means that this is a task that can now be handled by an iPad sitting at the back of the cafe, taking in orders and then passing the orders along to the chefs in the kitchen. So you can see, even in my sort of trite example of a cafe, how different forms of technology can do all three things: either create new tasks, replace old tasks, or change which tasks are done by labour and which ones are done by machinery. All right, so in the framework of this model, we can have all three of these things, factors happening. Either new automation, new tasks, or what we call factor augmenting advances, which means making labour or capital more productive in terms of which set of tasks they take on. Yep.
So can the classification of replaced tasks be completely distinguished from automated tasks?
So I'd say when we talk about classifying these tasks, and even classifying things between being sort of completely automated and technology, like it's a bit of there's no hard and fast rule set. When we kind of think about what tasks you do in the office, we literally just run a survey and say, what do you do? Has it been automated, and so on. So it's, there's always going to be a bit of subjective bias when it comes to measuring these things. Say for example the replacement of taking cash to the bank each night with the Tap and Go system. Is that the use of automation? Because now you've got sort of a piece of machine, equipment, IT equipment that now does all the Tap and Go and the retraction, the accounting for you. Is that a form of capital that's taken over a task, or is it being automated out of being required? So you could argue it either way. I think in general, there's a bit of a blurriness between what's technology and what's capital in sort of things, in that sort of thing. I think the ideal sort of distinguishing feature is let's say you were running a rideshare app and you had people drivers, you had cars, and then you had an algorithm that sort of assigned drivers to customers. I'd say that's a nice clean distinction between your capital, which is your cars, and your algorithm, that is technology that, if you improve it, could maybe make a more effective matching between customers and drivers. But not all examples are really that clean. Often it's a bit blurry. So yeah, you sort of have to take it on, you could argue it either way, and I wouldn't get sort of too hung up on what's a capital advancement versus a technological advancement. Okay, and we've seen that the changing nature of tasks happen in all sorts of different settings. So this graph here shows the fire protection industry or fire recovery industry, and what we've seen over the past few decades when it comes to firefighters and the work they do is a secular decline in the number of fires that are breaking out. We had a false alarm in Monash, in my building yesterday. No fire at all, and part of the reason why we rarely have fires is because we've got great smoke detection systems, we've got great sprinkler systems that can put out fires. We've invented little fire extinguishers that exist every floor, and so one of the great advances in technology means that the number of fires that are breaking out and burning down homes every year trending downwards. But does that mean we've made firefighters completely obsolete? No. If not, in fact, if anything, the opposite. The number of firefighters we've got has been trending upwards over time. And how do we square that circle? Well, firefighters have increasingly taken on other tasks. They don't just sort of sit around and do nothing. If you look at the data on fire calls, false alarms, and medical calls, you can see that the fire and false alarms lines are more or less the same, maybe a slight trend up in false alarms as we get sort of even more sensitive fire detectors or smoke detectors. But fire calls trending downwards. What's taken off is medical calls. The number of times that you get into a car accident, you call 000, you say, I need an ambulance for my accident, and you're just as likely to get a fire truck rock up with a whole bunch of safety equipment and medical equipment as you are to get an ambulance. So what firefighters do has changed. They still fight fires obviously, but they're much more likely to take a medical call than they are a fire call. And that's an example of how tasks change, but the demand for labour stays constant. All right, so when we think about how technology affects labour demand, we want to add up all these different effects. So all technology should hopefully make us more productive. I think we could probably all come up with a few niche cases where technology has made us less productive. Phones perhaps, social media, AI, scrolling, perhaps soon to come. But on the whole, most technology makes us more productive. And if it makes us more productive, it makes us richer, which is going to increase demand for labour on the whole. So that the main effect, or the sort of universal effect of technology, is what we call the productivity effect. All technology, hopefully, makes us more productive. The more productive we are, the more wealthier we are, the more demand we have for basically all types of labour, right? If you're, wake up on tomorrow and you found out you won the lottery, you would consume more of lots of different types of goods, and that's going to increase your demand for labour intrinsically. But on top of this productivity effect, we also have those three effects we talked about before. A displacement effect, where you've automated some labour out of existence, a reinstatement effect, where you've created new demand for labour because you've got new tasks coming along, and a substitution effect, where the task hasn't disappeared, but it's moved from the labour column to the capital column. And so when do we see demand for labour increase? Well, you're going to see demand for labour increase if the productivity effect outweighs the displacement effect. So even if you automate some labour, if it makes us richer, such that we want to consume more, then that's going to still increase labour demand. If your form of technology creates new tasks that need to be done, well, you're almost by definition going to involve more labour demand, because not only are we wealthier, more productive, but now we've got someone who, we need to create a whole career for social media managers that's going to suck in more and more people to do work. And when it comes to factor augmenting advances, it's going to depend on whether your form of technology substitutes for labour or complements labour. And this is something we'll get to in the class exercise in a few slides' time. And For what it's worth, the data on these factor augmenting advances suggests it's sort of roughly in between a substitute and a complement for labour, most technology on average. So the overall impact is relatively small. So when do we see the biggest positive impact for labour demand? When we see the productivity effect is really large. So the best automation increases in terms of jobs created are when we have sort of revolutionary advances that make us much, much more productive, much wealthier. Plausibly, artificial intelligence falls into this bucket. If we all suddenly become much more productive and we can, now suddenly manufacture cars and planes at a drop of a hat, or at least much more cheaply, that's going to make the whole economy more productive and much wealthier, and so we'll end up hiring more people to satisfy those desires that robots can't fill. Sort of paradoxically, the sort of very minor technologies that maybe eliminate a job or two but don't revolutionize productivity, that the economists argue that this is actually the most likely to result in fewer jobs, where you have a technology that fundamentally doesn't revolutionize anything, but sort of eliminates one or a few jobs without radically increasing productivity. And so what does this look like what do these sort of different effects look like if we dig into the data? Well, this graph here shows we're splitting the sample, the post-war sample, into two halves. So we're going to go first from the 50s to the 90s, or 47 to 87, and we're going to look at the rise in technology over these decades on the overall demand for labour, so the overall wage bill, and then how the different productivity, substitution, composition, and changing task content effects have made up that overall change. And what we see when we look at the data is that the overall productivity effect of new forms of technology vastly dominates all the other effects. Basically, technology has made us much more productive as workers in our economy, and that's driven the vast majority of what we see in the change for labour. Now, there are some substitution, composition, and change in task effects. If we zoom in on this line, we can see that we are, from the 50s to the 90s, we were roughly displacing as many jobs as we were reinstating. So in terms of tasks that were created versus tasks that were completely eliminated, the balance was roughly even. And so, we saw a fairly positive impact of technology on labour demand when it comes to the second half of the 20th century, whereby we got more productive, we got wealthier, that boosted our demand for labour and kept the vast majority of the population employed. And then there were some changes in task creation and destruction, but ultimately they cancelled out. What about since the 90s onwards? So in this case, the 90s through to 2017. Well, here we have a slightly different picture. So we've still got a productivity effect. So we're still seeing a vast increase in measured productivity due to the rise of technology. So all sorts of inventions. Think of the whole IT revolution occurred during this time. That's pushing up worker productivity and hence pushing up the observed wage bill. But we've started to see a change in the composition of task content. And so zooming in again on this line, we can see that we've started to see a stronger displacement effect than a reinstatement effect. And so tasks that are being automated away are occurring or being automated away at a faster rate than tasks that are being recreated or new labour that's being drawn into the system. So we're seeing a slightly less rosy picture from the point of view of labour demand for the 1987 to 2017 period. And we can zoom in on what type of workers have been most affected by this displacement versus reinstatement effect. So if we start with the left-hand side graph, this shows over the 1980s to 2016 task displacement, so the share of tasks in your job that have been automated away. And then on the x-axis you have the hourly wage. And then in the different colours we're seeing different levels of education. And what you see here is a fairly strong and clear downward relationship, which means the high paid you are, lots of questions, the less likely you are to be automated out of your work. Yep.
A few slides back, but when you said that the automation eventually creates new jobs,
Mhm.
is there a short-term decrease in employment as the automation comes in and removes the jobs before the new ones are created?
Not necessarily. If a new form of technology requires implementation costs, oftentimes that creates its own job. So if you think about, you need to install a bunch of machinery to do the job that previous workers are doing. Installing machinery takes jobs and time. So it's not necessarily a case there's a lag. There could be, but I wouldn't say there's any sort of universal truth behind that. Yep.
I was going to ask a similar question, but when things like the Industrial Revolution happened, would we have similar data so we can see how these trends compare to back then, or you don't really?
Look, we weren't running the ONET survey, which went out to people and said, "What are you doing today? What are you doing tomorrow?" It is true to say that workers were displaced. So we look at these lines and we say, "Oh, look, they cancel out." The blue line and the red line, the blue line and the red line are roughly equal, so the overall aggregate effect is zero. That's not to say that individual workers within this big aggregate pool of labour weren't worse off. If you were, a bookkeeper and you were great at adding up numbers in a column, and then Excel comes along and says, "Well, I can do that in a blink of the eye," you were almost certainly made worse off. There's a famous story about, the bank tellers were people who were automated. And if you actually look at the data on bank teller employment, you see it's actually still growing strongly. It's not like we've run out of people running working in banks. But what has changed is the roles and tasks that they do. No longer is it about adding up and making sure the spreadsheet works. It's more often about having a personal relationship, selling financial products, walking you through how to get a mortgage and what that means, and assessing credit card applications and that sort of thing. And that's changed in terms of tasks. So if you were really good at the spreadsheet side, but did not like talking about why a credit card will get you lots of Qantas reward points, you would have been worse off. You would have either lost your job or not got a promotion or what have you. So it's not to say that there isn't a lot of churn under the water, even if the aggregate sort of picture is flat. Yep. And then I'll get back to you.
How much government intervention
So it's a good question. How much did government intervention sort of affect these overall trends? My sense is relatively little. So, obviously we've got, government intervenes in the economy in a whole bunch of ways, but I would say most of the sort of government intervention that's aimed at minimising disruptions is fairly passive. So you have unemployment insurance. If you lose your job for whatever reason, you'll get a check from the government. But that doesn't necessarily sort of promote or mitigate against automation.
What about legislation that stops employers from just firing someone?
So yeah, worker protections do exist, and they I don't think they've ever really been applied to automation. They're sort of universal protections, but in a sense they're only going to work for so long. If it's a big enough innovation that's going to affect the whole industry, eventually you're going to, if not lose jobs, then maybe just kill firms. So, for example, if you passed a law that said all newspapers have to keep printing newspapers in paper and ink to keep our printing houses operational, there are obviously some newspapers still keep on printing, but the whole shift online wouldn't have occurred, and then probably what would happen is the newspapers would just go belly up, and new online newspapers would come along and eat their lunch. So, even if you sort of have very tight protections for workers in existing firms, it's very hard to stop new firms who can, they're new firms, they have no pre-existing commitments, to come along with a new technology and just say, well, we're going to be less constrained and eat your lunch, so to speak. And we have seen that time and time again, even without strong worker protections, where it's just sort of legacy costs mean that new companies can come around and sort of take over with new technology.
So how much of the reinstatement effect is people kind of like settling for lower paid jobs or jobs that aren't within their industry? Like say if you have a banker that just becomes a bartender because they get made redundant or something, and sort of getting captured in the reinstatement?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's hard to exactly track people across time. What we have seen is that there is considerable evidence that this has led to a change in wage outcomes. And in particular, as we talked about in the inequality section, it's led to a widening variance in wages and household incomes. And that's because a lot of the, if you think about a hospital, a lot of the very high-end jobs haven't been automated. We haven't automated doctors or surgeons yet. A lot of the low-skill jobs also very hard to automate, at least in this period of time, because if you're, say, a janitor, you might have low pay, but no one's going to be able to automate the role of a janitor. And a lot of those middle-skill jobs have seen wage decrease. So I think I've got a slide here that shows that dynamic in action. But yeah, absolutely, wage effects can happen, even if eventually you find a new job somewhere. It may very well be at a low wage. Any other questions before I trundle on? All right. So what we saw in the second half of the sample from the 90s onwards was a sort of a less positive picture. Look, we're still overwhelmingly better off with technology. We're still seeing big rises in productivity, big rises in the wage bill, but this automation in some of the task content is a little stronger than the reinstatement of new tasks, and so that's led to a drag on the wage bill of around 10 percentage points. And you can see the distributional impact in these charts here. So if you have a postgraduate degree, very highly paid, even back in 1980, and you saw very little of your job being automated. So postgraduate degree, in the US context, this would apply to doctors and lawyers, maybe even economists. Very little of their work ever got automated, so very low levels of task displacement. On the other hand, if you were had a high school education in grey, or you're a high school dropout in pink, much higher levels of task displacement going on there. And so you can, 1980s, a big part of the story would be automating various jobs on a factory floor. And that would have disproportionately hit your either employment or wage level. And you can see here sort of a similar story on the right-hand side. So task reinstatement from new tasks. How has that varied over the distribution of workers? Well, you can see that those postgraduate workers who weren't being displaced, well, they were getting new tasks created for them as well. And so the demand for highly educated labour was growing quite rapidly. The demand for less skilled or low education labour shrinking quite a bit over this period. And obviously this coincides with a period where the percentage of the population that was getting educated at a higher and higher level was rising. So it was not necessarily a bad thing that say the college education levels were seeing big increases in demand via more tasks and less displacement, because a larger share of the population was being college educated. But you can see it definitely hit different parts of the labour force to different degrees. So why hasn't technology caused mass unemployment in the past? The first reason is that technology can complement labour. You've got this labour augmenting technology. So when we have the IT revolution, entire career structures, entire degrees, entire promotion or labour markets was being created. Computer programmers, statisticians, people who knew how to use and manipulate big data. And so this big increase or this new technological innovation led to big increases in demand for this type of labour, as it made it more complementary or made it more productive. We've also seen new tasks be created that labour has a comparative advantage in, so that's always going to increase demand for labour. And we've also seen big increases in our incomes. That means we demand more of existing goods and services regardless. So this is one of the paradoxes of technologies. It can increase demand for your labour, even if it doesn't impact what you do at all. What's an example of this? Well, if you think about, cutting someone's hair, that's largely independent of labour and machinery. It usually takes one person cutting one person's hair. I suppose with the invention of hair clippers, you might do it a little bit quicker, but largely a job that is still to this day done with scissors, or at least my haircut is, that the technology hasn't changed a lot in many years. But we've seen increasing incomes and labour demand for hairstylists simply because we're growing wealthier as a society. As when people might have got a haircut once every 4 or 5 months, or got a haircut at home, in the decades past, much more likely to just go out and say, I'm wealthy, I can afford to spend, well, my haircuts are probably slightly on the cheaper side, but $20, $50, $100 on a haircut once every 2 months, once every month, because we as a society are wealthier due to that increase in technology. Another even more stark example of this is think about the job of a classical violinist. If you think about a chamber orchestra, that job is a job that has the exact same technology inputs today as it did 300 years ago. You need 4-string instruments and people to play them. That's a very a job that's been basically untouched in terms of the tasks going in or out in almost centuries. But we've seen a big increase in demand for musicians playing live concerts of this sort over the past 100 years. Why is this? Not because technology has changed any inherent aspect of the job, but because it's made society as a whole wealthier, and so now a greater share of the population can afford to listen to a live concert of string instruments, where in the past it would have been obviously limited to the very top fraction of the population. So we've seen in the data there is good reasons why technology hasn't caused mass unemployment in the past, but that doesn't mean that specific workers aren't made off. So as I sort of referred to earlier, bank tellers who weren't good at relationship building, they might be worse off. Construction workers who didn't have the skills or the licensing to operate heavy machinery, they would often be made worse off. So certain workers might be made worse off, even if the overall employment picture is relatively benign. And that's where we come to the story about wages. So obviously, the vast majority of people who are looking for a job can find a job, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to find a well-paying job or a job that's paying a wage equivalent to what they might have earned in years gone by. So when does technology lead to wage gains or wage losses? So in general, we tend to think of technology leading to wage increases via the productivity impact. If we're more productive, we'll be paid higher wages. So on the whole, new technologies lead to higher wages. But there is considerable variation in which workers are more likely to get higher wages. And in particular, we see workers' wages are more likely to rise if their labour is complemented by the new technology, if the elasticity of supply of the good is low, if the income elasticity of the demand for the good is high, and if the elasticity of demand for the good produced by labour is high. So let's talk through each of these in turn, because if you're anything like me and you've forgotten more microeconomics than you've ever learnt, some of these elasticities can be a bit confusing. So what about the first one, when labour is complemented by the new form of technology? Well, I think this is pretty straightforward. If a new form of technology comes along and it makes you more productive as a worker, then it's a pretty straightforward, intuitive statement from there that you're going to get higher wages in equilibrium. Because if you're more productive, firms are going to be willing to pay more to hire you, they'll be willing to pay more. And so, obviously there's a bargaining process that occurs for each worker, but in general, if there's a larger cake to be bargained over, you're going to be able to achieve higher wages on average. All right, what about with the elasticity of the supply of labour? So one factor that may prevent you from bargaining for higher wages is if there's a very large elasticity of supply of labour. So what if, we've seen this rise in productivity, firms want to hire more, and the question is, well, how easily can they get new labour into the market? And this ease of getting new labour supply to meet this higher labour demand is referred to as the elasticity of labour supply. And that elasticity parameter is a ratio of the change in labour supply, percentage change in labour supply, I should say, divided by the percentage change in wage. So let's say you've got this fantastic new technology, creates a new form of surgery, and you need to hire a whole bunch of nurses to help with the pre and post-operation care. How easy is it for you to find more nurses to staff your operating theatre for a given increase in the wage rate? Now, if the elasticity of labour supply is low, let's say it takes a long time to train up new nurses, you need to offer really big wages, wage rises to tempt them out of retirement, then wage rises are going to be a lot higher. So if you can't attract a very easily accessible supply of new nurses to attract into the labour force, then you're going to have to pay much higher wages in response to this form of technology. What about the income elasticity of demand? Well, this refers to how demand for the good rises as a function of total income or average income across the economy. So again, elasticity, or the income elasticity of demand, is just the percentage change in demand or output divided by the percentage increase in income. Any form of technology is going to, in general, increase incomes across the board. And so what goods are most likely, or what workers are most likely to see an increase in their demand for labour? Ones which have a very high elasticity of demand. So, think about it in terms of, let's say you're a experienced salesperson who sells Birkin handbags. Obviously, this is a good where demand will increase the wealthier we are as a society to a much larger extent than your average good. And so if technology comes along, makes us all wealthier, and we see a relatively large increase in income, and thus a large increase in demand for your services as a salesperson of Birkin handbags, then you're going to see a much larger increase in demand for your labour, and thus a larger increase in demand for wages. The opposite example of this is, let's say you work in the food manufacturing sector. Demand for food is fairly income inelastic. Even when you get wealthier, you eat a bit more, but it's not like you go from 8,000 calories a day to 16,000 calories a day. You might eat slightly better food, but you're not going to double your demand for food. And so they're going to see a relatively smaller increase in demand for their labour. And you see a similar story with the elasticity, the price elasticity of demand. So the price elasticity of demand, again, just relates the change in output as a function of change in price. So technology makes us wealthier, but it also makes us more productive, which leads to lower prices on average. And so the elasticity, or the price elasticity of demand, is going to determine how this reduction in price feeds through to a change in demand for your output. So again, if you've got a very price elastic good, then as productivity increases and prices come down, you're going to see a big increase in demand for the good that you produce. So again, you sort of see you can use the same examples we saw with the income elasticity of demand. If the price of high-end handbags comes down, you're going to see a much larger increase in demand than you would if you saw a reduction in price for, say, tinned peaches on the supermarket shelf. Tinned peaches, most people would buy the same regardless of the price, but people will consume a lot more handbags if they become more affordable, and so the handbag salesperson is going to see much larger increase in demand for their labour as they see a rise in the share of technology. All right, we might pause here before we go on to which jobs are most vulnerable and do our classroom activity now. So I've put on the Moodle page as I mentioned, the instructions for all of the in-class activities. So if you go down to topic 10, you can see the instructions for labour and technology, along with the previous ones and next week's one as well. So if you either want to open up or play along here, and there's also a Excel spreadsheet that I've shared both on the forum announcement and on the Word document. So you should click through to the middle page as well. So how does this game work? Well, on each table, each player is going to be the owner of its very own firm. And as the owner of a firm, your goal, with all firms, is to make as much profit as possible. And we may end up combining some tables together, so we have sort of a minimum amount of people on each table, ideally around 4. So how are you going to make profit in this game? Well, you're going to want to hire some capital and hire some labour. And with the labour and capital you have, you're going to combine them together to produce output that you'll sell for a profit. And the exact amount of profit you sell or you make is going to be given by this table here. If you click on the Excel spreadsheet, there's sort of a bit more detail on this. So how do you obtain labour and capital? Well, your labour and capital are going to be reflected by these cards here. I would show you the cards, but I've got a sealed deck, so I won't spoil the, open the deck. Oh, thanks. So the cards on your table reflect labour and capital. So red cards reflect labour, black cards reflect capital. You want to combine them together to produce output. How are you going to obtain your labour and capital? Well, I'm very generous. Everybody is going to start with 2 cards to start with. So everyone can pick up 2 cards from the top of the deck to sort of seed your firm with some labour and capital. But obviously you're going to want to buy more than that. So we're going to operate a series of auctions on each table. So each turn, one of you will pick up a card and say, I'm auctioning off a black card, so that is a unit of capital, and you'll all go around the table once and just offer a bid for what you are willing to pay for this unit of capital. So you might say, I've got a unit of capital, I'm willing to pay $1. And then the next player will offer a bid. You have to offer a higher price, obviously. You can't, no point offering a low price, or you can just pass. And once you've gone around the table once, whoever offered the highest price wins the unit of capital and pays that price. And each player will auction off 1 card twice. So you go around the table until each player has auctioned off 2 cards. And to make things a bit easy in terms of tracking your scoring, I've created this nice little Excel table. So if you open up the link, you'll see each student number has their own tab. So you can scroll across, hopefully you don't have to scroll too far. And you can use this table to keep track of your score. So the way it works is you first enter in your initial allocation in these 2 cells here, column B. So did you start with, say, 2 labour and 0 capital, or 1 of each, or 2 capital and 0 labour? Sort of 1 of 3 combinations. And then you track what purchases you make along the way just by listing their price. So in this case, I started off with 2 units of labour and 0 units of capital. In the first auction of the game, there was a unit of capital up for grabs, and I bid $5 for that unit of capital, and I won. So I just put 5 there, which was the price I paid. And if you look at the rest of these columns, they will automatically update to keep track of your position within the game. So the total spent on purchases is the total amount of auctions you've won. The total allocation is just your initial allocation plus whatever goods you've won via the auction process. And then these columns just here just keep track of your score. So your total score, if you had 2 units of labour and 1 unit of capital, is 30 minus the amount of money you spent on your auctions, which was $5, which gets you $25. I've also added this line here to sort of help you make optimal decisions in your auction. So if you bought an additional unit of labour, and there should be labour, not labour out, your profit would increase by $4. If you bought an additional unit of capital, it would increase by $7. So as a tip, I would not bid more than $4 for another unit of labour or $7 for another unit of capital if you were in this position. Those numbers will automatically update. And then don't worry about the last two lines, that'll be for rounds 2 and 3. All right, hopefully there are sufficient decks of cards.
Yeah, everybody needs to at least be a table of 4.
Yeah.
If not 5 or 6.
Yeah, so combine together if you're a smaller table, because obviously an auction between 2 people is a bit limiting. So if you have combined together and you've got your deck of cards, start by drawing 2 cards for each player. This will be your initial allocation. And once you've got your initial allocation, you can enter your initial allocation into the top of your Excel spreadsheet. Hopefully you've all found your tab in the Excel spreadsheet. Now, one last point of clarification. Obviously we run an auction and the highest person wins. You pay the price of the winning bid, but there's no one gets the winnings from the auction. They all flow back to me, the auction master. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. You don't have a tab. You don't. None of you have a tab. Does anyone else not have a tab? Oh dear. Okay. Create a tab, and I will and you can copy the template across. Does anybody have a tab? Have I managed to add the wrong names? The wrong class. Okay. New solution. Rename a tab as your own name. If it's a student email address, just rename it to Zach or Ellen, or any name that happens to be your own. And if you take over someone else's tab, that should hopefully preserve our scoring system. But do enter the correct name, because obviously there is a winner who gets the highest score across 3 rounds, and whoever wins will get a fresh deck as a prize. All right, hopefully you've managed to commandeer your own tab off one of the generic email addresses. Deal out your 2 cards for each player.
Can you guys find the cards?
Resist the temptation to steal people's names, if at all possible. All right, does everyone have their 2 cards? All right, once everyone's got their 2 cards, once you've entered your initial allocation into your score sheet to help you keep track of where you are, some brave volunteer can stick their hand up to go first. You pick up the top card, say, I'm auctioning off a red card or a black card, Labor or Capital, and as the auctioneer, you offer the first bid. So you say, I'm willing to pay $3. Then everyone else gets a chance to outbid you. Has everyone got a tab first? Yeah, I got mine. Cool. So enter first your initial allocation. So 2. Can anyone enter? Cool. So once you just added in one or two. No, it's just the number of cards. The actual numbers don't mean anything. Pick up top card. Say yeah. So the numbers on the card don't mean anything. It's just whether it's red. Yes. So pick up a card. Yeah. Pick up two cards to start with. How you guys doing? Brutally unfair. So it's not calling you. Look, if you can update. I assume we'll slowly catch up. So has everyone got the two cards? Yeah. So who's going first? So pick up the top card off the top. So you're auctioning off a Labour, unit of Labour. So you can have the first bid and then just go around the other one. No, you can do whatever you want, but it comes off the top. So if you have an unit of Labour, you can make a subscription to it. Betting on it, 5, 6, 0. You can bet more than that amount. Okay, so you've got two cards in there. Have you entered it into your spreadsheet? No, just one. So one or two. So pick up the top card. So flip it over. You're auctioning off 1 unit of so how much are you willing to pay for it?
So start us off with the bidding. So are you gonna get So let's go around this way. Bidding. Your class, that's got nothing. You've got zero. So, yeah. If you currently have 30, how do you get to it? How do you have 30? That would be zero.
Take it into the order, whoever gets in first, according to the order.
You sold the wine. Great work.
So, taking turns to pick up a card. So, if you want to go first, you're offering one label for sale. And you say how much you're willing to pay for it at the beginning of the label. You've already got two, so you can't really pay that much. So you say, I'll pay $1. Then anyone else can offer my price. Whoever offers the highest price.
This is so dumb. Go for one.
No, you can have four. You can have four. So if you average, for each one you bring, you just add it in the balance section. And that will Alright, we'll start with the first option and then if we go up and say, I'm just now, so how much are you looking to pay for one
We need to each sell 2 cards, guys. I'm sure.
So you're doing one chance. So you bid the highest $5, you win it. So you just add keep trying. So you bid $5.
Yeah, I was confused about this too. After that, it says you draw. Yeah, I know. I was confused about that.
Okay, reset. Which is good because you're
done the 2 rounds.
number 1.
Alright guys, I'll give you another few minutes to finish your first round. So everybody doing 2 auctions. So on average, you should have your 2 initial cards plus 1 to 3 extra cards you've won. Depends how long it takes to finish the first one, but one more round for sure.
So how many
2 auction decks. So all your cards minus 1 So if you list the price in I don't know, sorry. List price here. What you pay for each one, that'll automatically update.
I'll do my second one. So I can't do my
Alright guys, I'll give you 30 more seconds to wrap it up and then we'll have a look at the results across the class. Alrighty guys, if you turn your eyes to the summary tab, which I've got displayed up on the screen. So this tab links to your individual scoring tabs, and it shows the average wage and the average cost of capital across every single auction, across every single table. And in a fairly surprising twist of events, although I guess not, given the law of large numbers, the average wage is almost exactly the same as the average cost of capital. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, because at the moment, the game is perfectly symmetrical. Capital and labour are an equal supply, and they have the same impact on your production function. So, on average, people have paid the same amount for labour as capital, which is about 6.7, 6.9 on average, depending on which one you look at. So that's round one. We're now going to introduce a twist for round two. So in round two, Josh is going to, first put all your cards back into the deck to give them a good shuffle. In round two, Josh is going to add a dozen face cards. So jacks, queens, and kings to each deck. These cards represent technology. If you pick up a face card at any time, consider this a miraculous invention. You don't need to pay for it, you just get the card for free. And this free unit of technology will act as a substitute for labour. So what do you do if you pick up a face card? You can enter in column B, row 22, that you've got a unit of labour substituting technology. Okay? So a unit of labour substituting technology just gives you a free unit of labour, because you've got some technology that's come along that does the job of labour. So if you pick up a card with technology, you put it into your hand and then you keep on playing again. So you get sort of a free draw as well. So it's a free gift from heaven in terms of the free technology that just drifts around, or you pick up randomly. But then you've got to play the exact same game again. So you're still auctioning off labour, auctioning off capital, but now some firms have randomly got some technology that helps them substitute for labour. And what you should do, if you want to maximise your score, is take into account the fact that you've got additional labour supply in the pool of inputs, and accordingly change what you're willing to pay for more labour and change what you're willing to pay for more capital. Okay, so once you've shuffled in those 12 cards, start the process again. First, deal out 2 cards to start your allocation with. So once you've dealt in the face cards, deal out 2 cards to each player, or each player takes 2 cards. If you pick up a face card, you can take a 3rd card. So the face cards are always, you can draw another card. And the same with the options. Yeah. You can reset your scores as well. So reset your previous bids in your Excel spreadsheet, reset your previous allocation. got the scores of the auction. Just keep it at its hand for your gift of labour and then draw another one. No, you do. You can either add it to your initial allocation or there's row 22 has. All right, once you've dealt out 2 cards plus whatever technology you draw, start auctioning off twice each again.
I think we've got the hang of this. You can say it.
Alrighty guys, hopefully you've auctioned through the second round at a slightly more efficient pace and we'll come together to look at the results. Make sure you enter in your prices you've paid so we can average across the entire class. Alrighty guys, make sure you've entered your prices. In 30 seconds we're going to look at the final score. Alrighty guys, someone has managed to Alrighty guys, let's turn our attention back to the summary tab. So what's happened in round two? So in round two, we introduced an influx of technology that substituted for labour. And hopefully through your profit maximising, extremely rational and efficient pricing mechanism, we'll see a change in what happens to the average wage or the average amount you're willing to pay for labour and the average amount you're willing to pay for capital. And when we look at the numbers from round one to round two, we see the change you expect. When you flood the market with technology that substitutes for labour, we see a lower wage from 7.5 down to 5.2 and a increase in the value placed on capital. So congratulations, you managed to change your bidding strategy to reflect the new reality. So we don't have time to go through the labour complementing side, but the results, if things work out as you should, is to reverse that result. If we had a labour complementing form of technological change, we would see wages increase and the average cost of capital decrease. All right, I promised the highest score would get a pack of cards, and the highest score across 2 rounds, according to this very scientific method, was the person who got 64, which is the spreadsheet by Natalie. Who got 64? Natalie? Me, down here, congratulations. You are the winner for today. Alrighty guys, we've only got 15 minutes left, so let's go back to our slides and finish off with a discussion of which jobs are going to be most vulnerable and what does the research say about artificial intelligence, to the extent we have research about it so far. Actually, we have got a surprisingly large amount given how